Welcome to Just One Q, the podcast where we explore the latest ideas in workplace diversity, equity, and inclusion in conversation with thought leaders and DEI experts. Each episode, I ask our guests just one question, highlighting their area of expertise in DEI. The goal is to leave you with the tools and insights that you need to drive change in your own life, both professionally and personally. I'm your host, Dominique. I'm a diversity, equity, and inclusion educator and advocate working for the DEI e-learning consultancy, Dialectic in Guelph, Ontario. On this week's episode, I am joined by Dr. Rebecca Sutherns. Rebecca Sutherns is an insightful and high-energy collaborative strategist and world-class facilitator who has served as a trusted advisor to hundreds of mission-driven organizations across Canada and internationally. Rebecca brings intellect, enthusiasm, and varied experience in strategy development and adaptability when speaking, writing, and mentoring. She is a skilled communicator with a particular gift for helping leaders make wiser decisions faster. Rebecca is a certified professional facilitator, a frequent keynote speaker, and the author of 3 books, the most recent of which is Elastic, Stretch Without Snapping or Snapping Back, which we'll be digging into a little bit today. So hello, Rebecca. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Hi, Dominique. I appreciate you having me.
Thanks so much for being here. The question that we're going to explore together today is, how can leaders adapt to the demands of DEI work? And this question is really inspired by a flurry of recent articles, blog posts, and conversations about the term diversity fatigue in the DEI space. So what I'm reading and hearing from leaders and decision makers in DEI-specific roles is that they feel tired, discouraged, frustrated with a lack of progress on fostering more inclusive and equitable workplaces. McLean & Company just came out with their 2023 HR Trends report, and in it, DEI leaders identify the top barriers to their work as lack of time, insufficient resources, inability to create a unified strategy, lack of data, and lack of support from other leaders. So that's a rough context in which to do this already very difficult work. And it's no wonder, with that list, that a lot of organizations are losing their DEI leaders to burnout. Rebecca, you talk to a lot of leaders across various sectors. What are they saying and how are they faring right now in general?
I think we're being asked to do a lot of ongoing adapting in a lot of spaces right now. And obviously needing to learn and adapt and change and be responsive to context isn't new. And I'm really tired of hearing, this sort of VUCA, it's such a volatile environment. Yes, it absolutely is. And yet there does seem to be sort of an exceptional quality to that level of change, as things accelerate. And it's not just in the DEI space, right? It's, I remember one of the quotes that started me on this adaptability journey is that the slowest pace of change we will ever experience in our lives is happening right now. And I remember reading that from Dan Gilbert and just kind of my shoulders probably sagged. And I was like, it feels so much, can't imagine it speeding up. And I think, so I want to put your question in that context because, we are in a context of massive transformations across a variety of realms of our life. And during the pandemic, we saw that in spades, and yet it's also continuing now. So I don't want to minimize the DEI journey on this, but I want to put it in the context of, and it's a lot across a lot of areas. And I think post-pandemic, if we can even say that, I think people are surprised that most people aren't yet feeling awesome. There hasn't been the big street party celebration of not only when is this over, but when are we all going to feel better? Or if we've given up on when are we going to get back to normal, we've at least said, when am I going to feel like I'm thriving? And so inside that context, there's a lot of conversation about burnout, a lot of good writing on that. I certainly look to Jennifer Moss's work in that space that's local to where you and I both live in Southwestern Ontario. But there are many others that are writing in that space about, how the World Health Organization understands burnout to be. And again, not specific to DEI, but when you add that in, I think there's a combination of frustration, a steep learning curve for many people, and the stakes are high. And so for those that care about this, they care, right, deeply. And so the level of frustration at a lack of progress is very high. And just to echo what you were saying in terms of seeing this other places, I was reading just recently kind of a trends report that the Future of Good had put together earlier this year about, I think it was 23 trends for 23, something like that. And one of them was basically, we will continue to see no progress on the DEI front, and it wasn't quite that casual, but it was that idea. It wasn't just, I was hoping it would say, DEI will continue to be at the forefront of everyone's minds, but it was very much, it will be at the forefront of everyone's minds and nothing will change. And so
Yeah.
I think the way that you're framing this is probably quite, accurate in some cases, but I do also want to say that I think there's reason for hope, and there's things that we can do to build our capacity to adjust to this. But I think it's a challenging order for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and we're here to talk about some of those solutions, right? The environment being what it is, we still need to, and we're asking a lot of leaders, we're asking them to adapt personally to this sometimes new social realities. We're asking them to deliver sort of DEI results without proper support. We're asking them to do it in an environment that isn't necessarily very easy for them to navigate. And these tasks in some cases are new and very challenging. So, but absolutely, we're here to talk about sort of the solutions. And I think that, your work really speaks to some of these, and in the concept of elasticity and being an elastic leader really appeals. And it's not just for DEI, it is definitely across leadership in all sectors. But maybe if you wouldn't mind just unpacking that a little bit at a high level, what some of those strategies are that you think might be most useful and applicable to the DEI space.
Yes, absolutely. So if we think about the metaphor of, say, a rubber band or anything that has some elasticity to it in the physical realm, almost by definition, it's something that can stretch and take on new shapes in a new setting or under new pressures. It will assume a new shape. It'll take on almost like new responsibilities, right? It can hold together things bigger than itself, that kind of thing. And you can hear the parallel with humans, right? When we are given a challenge, we will usually do what we can to rise to it, and we will learn and we will adjust and we will find ourselves in new shapes. And so to the extent that DEI is a stretch for us of addressing it well, I think we have a level of elasticity as humans that we can draw on for that. And I think in general, what happens again with a physical elastic is that if you're asked to stretch too far for too long, it's really hard to both maintain your elasticity or to go back the way you were before. And in some ways that can be a good thing, right? Because if we don't want to go back the way we were before and or shouldn't for some reasons, and or it has some level of comfort but isn't serving us well, part of what I'm interested in is encouraging people not to sort of unconsciously just snap back into old ways of doing things. And as people are navigating new workplace realities, for example, many are saying, hey, I used to be that person. I used to be willing to work under those conditions, and now I will not. And it just doesn't fit anymore. So the snapping back of an elastic, which again is in the physical realm, kind of a definition of elasticity in physics or materials science. In the human realm, we get to be intentional about the extent to which we snap back, but also either because we've been stretched for too long or maybe too far too fast. That's where the burnout piece can happen, right? We can snap. We can also snap, though, if we aren't stretched. So just like a rubber band that sits on your desk for, 6 months, and then you pick it up and try to use it, it gets brittle and it doesn't stretch. So I think maintaining a level of elasticity and stretch is really healthy for us, but not being asked to stretch too far for too long, too fast, right? So if we apply that metaphor to a DEI learning space, one of the areas that I see that humans are not the same as a physical rubber band, and in fact, we are superior to that, is that we can learn this. I think we can learn the skills of adaptability so that our ability to stretch can grow over time. So we're not like, a little tiny elastic band that, if you put it under too much pressure, it's going to snap in your hand. For us, we do have presumably a limit. So I'm not suggesting we are infinite in our ability to respond and learn, but we do have the ability to expand that capacity. So that's what I'm most interested in, is what does it take for people to learn to be more adaptable. And in our case today, it might be to learn to adapt to the requirements of a commitment to DEI, but it could apply equally to any other learning environments that are asking us to stretch into new places or take on some new shapes.
Yeah, that's great. I love this metaphor so much. I mean, there are limits to every metaphor, but it's such a good one. And it sends me to a personal place where I'm evaluating my own capacity over the course of years. And I think about, big life changes and challenges that I have faced and how my own elasticity and ability to kind of grow and stretch and adapt also is matched by this increased capacity in general. And so then there's always this little tug of war. Do you let yourself shrink back, or do you use your new capacity toward other things? But certainly another way to think of this is resilience or grit. Like, there are lots of different frames that people use to kind of have this conversation and to talk about how we grow and change. But I love this idea of adaptability. And I'm wondering if we can unpack it even further, and just if you could talk about, it's tempting to think adaptability is just you either kind of have it or you don't, or some people are just better at stretching than others. What are things that we can actually practically do to increase our capacity to adapt to difficult circumstances and to new challenges?
Well, the good news is that we are building our evidence base around this to actually understand the answer to that, which I love. So most of what I'm about to say comes from work that's being done through an organization called AQAI, which is Adaptability Quotient. They have developed a tool that helps to measure the adaptability of groups and teams. And so I'm appreciative of their work, and I work as a certified coach with them. So that's where what I'm about to say comes from. What I love about the work that they're doing is that it tells us that there are all kinds of ways both to be adaptable and to learn adaptability. So there's not just one pathway to that. And I think of it, to use another metaphor, I think of it like finding our way through a patch of woods or something. If we're in dense forest, I would rather take the trail than I would hack my way through, untraveled bush or something. And I feel like that with adaptability, where if I can find a pathway that suits me, that's already kind of easy and clear for me toward that destination of greater adaptability, why not take that rather than taking the hard way? And the hard way is different for each person. And so I love that we have in that tool 15 different elements that combine to build someone's adaptability profile. And so if you think of all the different combinations of 15 things that could be put together, each of us has a particular preferred way of adapting. So it's not a question of, will we adapt? The answer is yes. Is it useful to adapt? Yes, we don't have a choice. Let's find our easier ways to do it. So you mentioned resilience and grit. Those are 2 of the 15 ways, for example. So if I am someone who is very resilient, meaning I bounce back in the face of setbacks, and I'm someone who is really gritty, which means I'm persistent in the face of challenges. So I will stick with something and I will bounce back from setbacks. I have a particular way then of tackling adaptability challenges. On the other hand, maybe those aren't really strong for me, but maybe I'm really good at unlearning things, which means that ways of doing things that served me in the past, or ways of thinking that are no longer serving me, I can let them go. And I can attach to a new way of thinking or being and doing things in the world more easily than some others might. And if I could combine that with one of my strengths of cognitive flexibility, for example, which means I can see lots of ways to solve a problem. So imagine I can see lots of ways to get at something, and I'm willing to unlearn my old ways of doing things. You can imagine that that kind of person is able to say, well, if that way doesn't work, I'll try another way. And hey, I used to think about DEI issues or not think about them, in these ways. And it's time for me to be open to learning a new way. Whereas somebody else might be, kind of the gritty and persistent type, right? That's doing that. Or someone else might say, I am a good risk taker and I'm a good big picture thinker. And big picture, I can see that this DEI pathway is where we have to head, and I'm willing to experiment to get there. And I'm not that worried about getting it wrong because I'm actually good at putting all my chips in the center of the table and giving things a shot. So maybe that's the way that person does it. So I'm just trying to paint a few pictures here to say there's lots of ways to be good at adaptability, and it is a learnable skill. So if people are feeling kind of stretched to their capacity in this area, part of me would wonder if they could both take a breather sometimes, which I realize is hard when the stakes are high, but I also think if we stretch for far too long, we need to catch our breath sometimes. But if we've done that or we don't have access to that, it might be time to switch to a different mode of being adaptable. So maybe being, gritty and persistent is exhausting us.
Right.
But maybe we could draw on our environment, for example, because that's another way to be adaptable, is that our team, our physical environments can help us adapt. And so maybe it's time to lean into the energy that others around us can provide, or find a more inspiring venue or workspace, which actually can make us more creative in ways that we didn't have access to over the last few years. So I would just encourage people to remember that they can learn this stuff, but also they can find their happy place in terms of learning it in a way that suits their best, easiest pathway to be an adaptable leader.
I love this idea of having a toolkit of adaptability so that when we're facing sort of adaptability burnout, when the challenges keep coming, and they will, we've addressed that. We've said it's not going to get any slower. It's not going to get any easier. Certainly in terms of DEI, we know that DEI is sort of slipping in the ranks as a priority of organizations over the last couple of years. We've seen it being knocked down a couple of pegs. So the challenges will continue. But I love this idea. It's so hopeful that even if I know, okay, I've been asked to adapt, and it's really hard, I can almost find a new way of adapting that has some rest in it for me, or that is a bit more functional or restorative. So I'm still going to have to adapt, but I can do it in a way that sort of allows a fresh perspective, or maybe I can find a way to catch my breath in just shifting gears to this new way of adapting. And this is, psychologically, that's a very powerful tool. And I guess practically, if we actually implement these things, we might find surprises. We might find new and different approaches to old problems just by switching the ways in which we adapt. I can imagine that for sure.
Yep. I really see that even in a really practical way. I spend a lot of my time facilitating group processes. And sometimes if a group is stuck, one of the ways to help them get less stuck is to change the mode. So for example, if I'm doing something out loud with a group, I'll ask them to draw it. Or if I'm doing something on paper, I'll ask them to do something a bit more maybe auditory or kinesthetic, or get outside, or just something that changes up, maybe not the topic we're working on, but just the way that we're approaching it is sometimes enough just to sort of jostle us out of our rut. And I do really see the benefit of that, even behaviorally or cognitively, in adaptability. It's interesting that you, two things. One is that interesting you were talking about DEI kind of dropping down the priority list a bit. If I can encourage you and your listeners, when I'm doing strategy facilitation with my clients, which is mostly what I do, almost every client I've worked with over the last couple of years is making sure that DEI has prominence in their strategies. They don't know how to do that. They're struggling with actually the learning curve of making that happen.
Yeah.
But I'm still seeing it there, which I think is a really helpful and encouraging piece. And you mentioned what I described earlier as being hopeful. I'm interested in that choice of word, because of the 15 things in that adaptability quotient toolkit we were discussing, hope is one of the 15, and it's actually the most powerful one. Like if I had to choose evidence-wise, if you look at the correlations between adaptability and each of the 15, hope is the number one determinant of somebody's adaptability. And it's not just a sort of Pollyanna optimism. It has actual components to it that have been well researched in hope theory. So mostly three things. One is that belief in a positive future, which is kind of what we would think of as hopeful. So it's kind of that optimism. It's that sense that things are getting better, not worse. But it also is partly being able to see that there are pathways to get from where we are to that more positive future. So it only has the power of optimism, I guess, if we can believe that it's an attainable destination for us. So it's not imaginary and fluffy. It's actually, there is a way to find our way to that more positive future. And then the third piece is motivation or agency, an ability to travel that pathway. So we believe the future is bright. We believe there are ways to get there, and we can actually keep moving along that pathway toward getting there. If we have those three things in place, we have hope. And that kind of hope actually has that extra powerful influence over people's ability to be adaptable. And the other thing I love about that, and it's true not just for hope, but for the other dimensions I'm mentioning, is that it's both kind of an individual and a team sport. So you can do it alone, and your team can do it, and or you can do it in the context of your community or relationships. And so I love that about it. It's not just an individual assessment that happens to get kind of cobbled together with other people's. It's that our ability to be adaptable people happens in community. So we might have some skills, temperament preferences that lead us to be more or less adaptable in certain ways, but our environment does that too. And it's not just the physical environment I mentioned earlier, but because this is largely a tool for workplace assessments, it's usually our team and or corporate environment, our organizational context, that can either really hamper or really amplify our abilities to be responsive. And I think if we can align all of those features of, our personal temperament preferences, where our collective experiences are taking us, and kind of what our context is demanding of us, if we can align all of that, we are much less likely to get exhausted by this over time than we are if we're trying to work, sort of push against we're trying to follow an adaptability path that just does not suit us.
Yeah, this is really powerful. I'm hearing a lot of practical recommendations in these words. So there's, like you said, it's not this Pollyanna version of hope, but what I'm hearing is choosing your community. I'm hearing setting goals and having, metrics related to the work that you're doing and a clear path. I'm hearing things about having strategy and operationalizing that. I'm hearing all of this stuff packed into just this one piece of hope, which is like one adaptability strategy. So I think, the work that you're doing, and certainly these adaptability modes, are really full of insight and full of sort of useful things that we can embrace as leaders who might be struggling with burnout or who need to find a new path. So I'm really grateful for all of this insight. I think it's encouraging. It's really encouraging and positive. And again, I mean, what we're not trying to say is that any individual leader is going to be able to make up for a complete lack of support within their organizations or within DEI work. I want to make sure that, we're also admitting the challenge. It is difficult, but certainly some of these adaptability strategies might allow people to stay in the game and to make some progress rather than to burn out on these challenges that will persist. So I really appreciate your insights on this. As we round the bend, I just want to encourage our listeners, especially DEI leaders who need a boost, to read more about Dr. Rebecca Sutherns' work on being an elastic leader and some of these adaptability strategies, which are detailed in her latest book. And if you're curious about Rebecca's work, you can find a link to her website and to her socials in the show notes. And Rebecca, just as a last bonus question, is there any other person or organization's work that you'd like to amplify in this conversation?
The one that came to mind first is actually a strange way in on this, but it would be for folks to have a look at the AQAI work, because it's an organization it's based in the UK, but the research comes out of a university in Madrid, and there are practitioners of this all over the world, but it's a very new tool. And so if people are interested in digging in specifically to the adaptability space, I would look to that tool. And then more generically, I just want to acknowledge the many, I work with probably 50 to 60 organizations a year, mostly in the nonprofit space. And I just want to amplify their work in the sense that I think they have a real intention to do this well, and yet are feeling, as you've outlined, reasons why this is really hard. And I guess what I'd like to do is to say that there are lots, just like there's lots of ways to be adaptable, there are lots of ways to get good at DEI. And I'm acknowledging the clients that I've worked with over the last while who are saying, you know what, we're having trouble making DEI progress in some areas, but actually in some of these other areas, we are either already strong and or are willing to get stronger because we know all the benefits of diverse teams, for example. And, I had one client recently say, oh, we're struggling with, in their case, it was really struggling with racial or ethnic diversity.
Mm-hmm.
And yet they could see that they were doing a really good job in terms of age diversity and gender diversity. And so we were able to look at the areas that they're strong in and say, okay, we can't all get amazing at all of the ways to be inclusive simultaneously. Where are the strengths? Where are those gaps? And so I just want to really shout out all of the community-based organizations that are trying their best to do this in the context of a lot of stretching, a lot of being pulled in multiple directions. So I'm sorry that's probably not as specific as you were hoping for, but I've got too many folks in my head to name.
No, that's
one,
great.
I just want to acknowledge that there are community leaders who are trying to do a really good job in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's wonderful. And I'm sure they appreciate the shout out. So Dr. Rebecca Sutherns, thank you so much for joining us today. And as always, I want to welcome any of our listeners to reach out to me if you'd like to be a featured guest on the podcast, or if you'd like to sneakily nominate someone else. You can find my email in the show notes. I'm Dominique. Thank you so much for listening, and see you next time on Just Fine Q.